Our next talk comes from another T19, Spencer Cromwell.
Can you hear me okay? Great. 10 years ago, I made a decision about my life that would really change absolutely everything about what I did from that moment and who I was after that time. At the ripe old age of 16, I made the decision that I wanted to become a conductor. I wanted to conduct orchestras and operas and choirs in the great concert halls of the world. I had trained as a classical pianist from an early age, and after years of practicing in isolation, 6, 7, 8 hours every day, alone in tiny rooms, I began to feel this need for music to be more about sharing this experience with others. As a solo pianist, for every hour that you actually perform, you are practicing hundreds of hours by yourself with no one else. I knew I just didn't want to spend my whole life locked away in a practice room, and so through my love of the piano, I eventually fell in love with the orchestra, and I fell in love with the person who leads it, the conductor. Who is the conductor? What does this person actually do, right? To me, from afar, this person was an embodiment of the spirit of the ensemble. They led the audience and the players and the music forward. They inspired the musicians, and they conducted an interpretation that was their own. I also knew that they waved their arms around a lot, and they made a lot of really expressive faces like this, and like this, and like this. They had the great privilege of bringing it all together, the highest of musical honors. And so at 16, I found myself asking the question, what can I do to become the person I see on stage at the front of the orchestra at Lincoln Center? And the next 10 years was nothing short of an obsessive and relentless pursuit to find an answer to that question. I'm going to get emotional. I started by being rejected everywhere. My first request was to attend the conducting class at my Saturday music school. It was reserved for orchestra musicians only because you play and then you conduct. I did not play an orchestra instrument, and so the answer was a very clear no. So I did what anyone does who has a dream and a mission and no plan B. I begged. I begged my way into that class, and I think after a couple weeks I just wore the professor down and I was in. Fast forward to my very first conducting class, standing in front of the ensemble of musicians for the very first time. I'm terrified. I remember the baton like shaking in my hand, wondering if anyone could see as I stared at the musicians in front of me for the first time. And I realized for the first time in my musical life that I didn't know anything. I'm not saying I didn't pay attention in conducting class or that I didn't study music. What I mean is I was standing in front of a group of people who had been playing their instruments for well over a decade. People who were playing instruments I had never played, let alone even touched. And now I was going to tell them what to do. How can you even begin to tell someone who's been playing the cello for 10 years how to play the cello when you've never even touched a cello? It didn't make any sense. And so I had this expectation going into this experience. I was so excited. I just thought that being in love with the music and bringing people together and communicating what I knew from the score, that was going to be enough, that it was going to be this awesome experience. And instead, I was just terrified that I had no idea what I was doing. And what changed in me in that moment of fear was that my perspective shifted from my role as a director to my role as a facilitator. My role wasn't to master every instrument. I was there to help the group in front of me, the experts, be better together. And with that realization that this art is not about you at all the pressure and the fear was lifted, and I was hooked. These are my first 2 concerts ever. I was 17, both Beethoven. After 2 years of studying and conducting class, I applied to Yale because it was the only college I knew of that had 5 undergraduate orchestras, and I wanted to conduct one. And so on the very first week of freshman year, I set up individual meetings with the heads of each of those orchestras, and every meeting I got the exact same answer. Absolutely not. I was told that conducting positions were reserved for seniors, sometimes even hired professionals, and definitely not for freshman pianists. 4 no's later, I was still hellbound on figuring this out. And on the very last meeting, with a tiny, unknown ensemble on campus, I begged again for just one opportunity to do this, just one time to conduct the group. And the answer was maybe. And then it was yes. One piece, one concert, that's all I got to prove myself. It was following that concert that I went on to become the assistant conductor and then the music director for 2 more years. But with only about 20 players, I knew we needed musicians, more musicians, to do the types of pieces that I'd always dreamed of doing. So again, I just started asking. I asked anyone who would listen to me to play for this group. I would approach people on the street who had musical instrument-shaped suitcases like this. This is cello, okay? And I'd ask them to come play. I'd sometimes even forget to say my name. And they would say no. And I would get their email address, and then they would politely say no again. And then we would put on a concert, and some of those people who had said no decided to join. And some of the people in the other 4 orchestras decided to join. People started saying that word I had rarely heard on this journey. They said yes. Eventually, we grew the group to become the largest student-run orchestra at the university, and each week it was my job to create an environment and an experience that would make people want to come back and to keep playing. And they did. And I was in love with every single moment. This is when things finally came together, and I felt like the universe was finally answering my call. Eventually, I conducted my first opera, and then a second, and then a third. I began conducting a course in New Haven, and I went on to perform with a bunch of other ensembles. I started to get paid for my work, and for the first time since I began pursuing this dream, I had more opportunities than I knew what to do with. After years of being told, no, absolutely not, you're too young, you don't play an orchestra instrument, you don't have enough experience, you are 16 years old, I myself could finally say, no, thank you. Through the hundreds of hours I spent on the podium working with musicians, I had become a fundamentally different person. The biggest thing I learned as a conductor was that I loved helping people grow. The role for me was about helping a group get from point A to point B, and I was so in love with the privilege to be able to do this work. The second thing I learned is that nobody calls bullshit faster than an orchestra. If you are there for yourself, if you're there to inflate your ego, you're done. No one will listen to you. Orchestras can and will, fun fact, conduct themselves. They absolutely can do it. To stand in front of any group, you learn to embrace your role as a facilitator. Conducting by its nature is the paradox of claiming to know nothing and know everything at the same time. But these lessons were not the only transformation I had on this journey. In college, I went out on a limb and I applied to a conducting program in Italy designed mostly for graduate students, and somehow I got in. And for the first time in my life, I was conducting in a real professional hall, an opera house in the mountains of Spoleto. I felt like I was in a dream. I could not understand what got me there, but in very short order, that dream just collapsed. Conducting alongside students and professionals who were 5 to 10 years ahead of me was a turning point, as I had 2 huge, devastating realizations about myself. The first was, I was not good enough to be a professional. I saw talent on a level I had never experienced. And I realized that the skills needed to be a professional go far beyond loving music and loving working with musical groups. Things like an expansive knowledge of music history, basic aptitude on multiple instruments, really skilled sight reading, international competitions under your belt, connections in the music world, and a ton of luck. All of these things were required just to have the slightest chance at a low-level symphony that is tiny, that you've never heard of, in the middle of nowhere. I didn't have any of these things. None of these things described me at the time. But the second realization was the one that really hit home. And it was that I didn't have the same priorities as the people around me that I was idolizing. I just loved helping groups of musicians come together to create something. That's it. And so what had started as this dream to conduct at Lincoln Center became a dream of just working with passionate people. I didn't care how good they were. For me, it was just about the process. Apparently, I'm a process person. Getting from A to B. It was about the joy that comes with pulling the best out of others, and I knew that that's what I cared about. That's why I loved being a conductor. I didn't care about conducting the New York Philharmonic, but that meant that this dream was over. Because to be a pro, I had to have more, and I needed to want it more, and I didn't, and I knew that. 4 years at age 20 is a fifth of your life. I had spent a fifth of my life chasing something every day, giving up everything for this, every free moment, every bit of free energy I had from the age of 16, hundreds of hours. And I realized I didn't want this anymore. I returned home at the end of the program, and I didn't know what to do. So, ready to move on to the next chapter, I focused very much on my identity. Either I was a musician or I was not, and I decided with those realizations that it was okay to let it go. I had made peace with it. And I was realizing that all the things I learned as a conductor oddly made me really good at my job at Morgan Stanley. Working with experts, rallying people around a cause, public speaking, creativity, learned some Excel, ready to go, right? All right, so I had taken on this new identity, and I was really good at it, and I was proud, and I still played the piano now and again, but music felt very unfinished. So 2 years went by, and I got an unexpected phone call. A former teacher was telling me that there was a youth orchestra in New York looking for another conductor to add to their roster. And I thought to myself, this just isn't me anymore. This is a job for people who actually gave themselves to this profession. This is the prize for people who had committed to the toil and rejection of the world of classical music. But I went to the audition anyway, thinking I would immediately be exposed as a fraud, the Morgan Stanley analyst at the podium. But somehow I got it. With all the thousands of musicians in New York who would have died for this role, a paying conducting position with a premier youth orchestra, I have no idea how this happened. These high school students in this orchestra trained at places like Juilliard on Saturdays, and they played with me at the Kaufman Music Center on Sundays. We played so many different halls and had such incredible experiences together sharing music. I saw in them the person I used to be, and I conducted them with greater pride and excitement than I could have ever conducted the New York Philharmonic. That experience helped me stop focusing so much on identity and to start focusing on what I was actually doing with my life, and that was working with passionate musicians, not for glory, not for dreams of conducting at Lincoln Center or being a professional, but the way that I realized that I now wanted to. It brought me back to the joy of why I started doing this in the first place, and for the first time, it was okay that I was never going to be a professional. And then in January 2014, I don't know how it happened, but somehow we made it to Lincoln Center. Conducting that performance half a decade after I thought this wasn't who I was anymore was to date one of the most transformative experiences of my life. And it was with that season that I again said goodbye to the world of classical music, but not with sadness or the sense of the unfinished, but with knowledge about myself and with lessons that I carry all the way to Tuck. Above all, I left the world of classical music with a shift in my understanding of what it means to pursue a dream. I realized that having the opportunity to get so close to something you want so badly, and then realizing when you get there that it's not what you want, that process can teach you so much more about what that dream actually looks like for you. And for me, that dream was about being surrounded by passionate musicians and having the privilege to help them get from point A to point B together. This is not the answer I expected to the question I first asked when I was 16, but I am so grateful to have found it nonetheless. Thank you.